Hi, everybody. Like Isaac said, my name is Travis Wilson. I'm a corporate and securities attorney at a firm called Jones Waldo, downtown Salt Lake. Corporate securities, I guess, is a fancy way of saying business attorney. And here today to talk about starting a business, not a startup. I don't know. I know this is a business class. How many of y'all are planning on starting a business at some point in your life? Almost everybody. How many of you maybe even have started that process now, or perhaps even have a business that you're involved in, that you've started and you're active? Okay, few less. Okay. Hopefully today is relevant and will provide you things to think about and how to do that better. For those of you that haven't yet done that, or you may think about it later in life, hopefully some of this is instructive on how you can go about maybe doing that. Let me tell you first, I'm an attorney at a firm called Jones Waldo. That's the picture on the left. That's our building downtown Salt Lake. We have 5 offices in Utah. I guess interestingly, Jones Waldo, I believe, is the oldest law firm in Utah. We were incorporated in 1874, and our founder, a guy named Joseph Rollins, was instrumental in drafting the Utah Constitution, the charter for statehood, and ever since then we've been doing what we do in the Utah legal market. So over the years, 130 some years, we've represented the big and famous best companies in Utah, in the region. Continue to do that today, provide them advice on all kinds of legal issues, and it's actually really a lot of fun to do that. I'm also what's called a managing director of a private investment firm called Merit Venture Partners, based in Bellevue, Washington. Captive fund. It's our own money, so we can kind of do whatever we want. We're not bound by charter or investment charter or shareholders, anything like that. And that's also very satisfying to kind of be on the front end of the legal issues and also on the investment issues. And so in my world, I can see this from 2 different angles. I'm an advisor in the legal context and then also an investor in the other side. So hopefully some of what we talk about today comes from that lens, those 2 sides of the coin. I'm not an active entrepreneur, I'll just tell you that up front. I'm not a guy that develops code and starts businesses and does that. I'm a guy that helps you get your business going or invest in your business. So keep that in mind. My background, I grew up in Seattle, Washington, on the left. And when I grew up, I had kind of a unique upbringing. My dad retired when he was 32 years old. And from the time beyond that was a professional investor. And so from the time I was a little kid, like 10 or 11 years old, we had a lot of free time. That's what we did. And his favorite thing to do on like the weekend or like nights or whatever in the summers was, instead of we wouldn't really go on vacation or anything, his favorite thing to do would be on the weekend to say, hey, let's go work on something at my office, right? So it's like kids and teenagers, and that's kind of what we did for fun. We'd go work on stuff with him. And if it was, tech deal he was working on, or it was a real estate investment or whatever, that's like kind of what we did for fun, right? So my first job, I was 11 years old, and I actually still have the paycheck stuff from this. I was paid 35 cents an hour to water plants at a shopping center, right? And he'd drop me off in the morning, come back in the afternoon with a hose and watering trees and flowers and all that kind of stuff. The next summer I was promoted. I got 50 cents an hour. I was 12, and I swept sidewalks with a broom all day. He'd drop me off in the morning, sweep sidewalks, and come back, and kind of went like that. And by the time I was in high school, I was involved actually in their deals, right? Working with his team, doing actual deals, finance projections, due diligence on transactions and stuff. And so it's been kind of a hands-on education for me in terms of my upbringing, kind of growing up in that world. I then took that training and went to college. I'll say I'm not a graduate of UVU. I went to BYU, but decided that I would become a policy wonk. I was interested in politics and I liked policy, and decided that for me the best career in the world would be a policy advisor in Washington, D.C. until I actually lived there. That's the building I lived in Georgetown, right there in the middle. It's a cool place to live until you actually have to go to work and be a policy advisor. And I realized that was like the worst thing that anybody could possibly ever do for a job, right? And instead of growing up where it's creativity, right? It's financing innovation. It's figuring out how to monetize innovation, right? If you're a developer or whatever it is you're doing in business, figuring out how to make money from that and make it better and do it better than your competitors and all that. I found myself day to day figuring out how to not be disruptive and not be innovative. It was like how not to rock the boat too hard, right? Because, you don't want to upset anybody, right? So that wasn't for me. I'm not saying it's not for everybody, but it just was not for me. And so around that time, I had started thinking about going to law school and ended up moving away from Washington, D.C. Actually came back to Utah. In the process, met my now wife. And that was our first house, right, in law school right there. So significantly worse than the house in Georgetown, right? a little bit of a step down. So while in law school, the first couple, is anybody here planning on going to law school? I should ask you that question. 1, 2, okay, 3, good for you. So if you're anything like me, what you'll find is the first year of law school is like sheer terror, right? It's like, it's just a lot of time and it's very difficult. And then after you're through your first year, maybe the first semester of your second year becomes very, very boring, right? That's kind of how that goes. And that was, for me, that was definitely the case. And so my second year of law school, I was like literally bored out of my mind, right? You're going to classes. The professors half the time aren't even showing up because they're bored too. And so I started to think about what I might like to do, right? And so in law school, I started to get back involved in working with my dad doing deals. So in the law library, like I'd go to school and then I'd do my homework and then I'd stay in the law library and I'd put together different investment packages. Back then it was the real estate boom, and so most of them were real estate syndications or finance investments in the Midwest. And that window right here was my office, right? My first office, and bootstrap at its absolute definition, right? And did that for about a year and a half, had tremendous success, really enjoyed that. Came time to graduate and had an offer from several law firms, and one of them being Jones Waldo, and that was what we decided to do. And it's made all the difference, frankly, as opposed to living in New York or LA or something. Living in Salt Lake has been probably the best decision that we've ever made as a family, to come back and have kind of a quality of life around what we do. Here's my family, just real quick. It's us right there, my wife and I, our 2 kids. It's me working at my office there with my son, which happens more than I'd like to admit. This is another part that's fun about my job as a lawyer, right? This is a client of mine. Some of you may know him. Lives here in the Valley. That's about 10 years ago on Wall Street. At the time, he was involved in several businesses and over time focused on one of them. And in the last year, sold that business to a company called Automatic. I don't know if any of you know that name. Do you use WordPress? Automatic is the company that owns WordPress. So a good result for him. That's a lot of fun to be involved in that kind of endeavor, right? From startup all the way through to growth to an exit, right? That's kind of what is a lot of fun about entrepreneurship and professional investment. I don't know, I don't see Don Watkins here. That's a joke. That's how I met Don Watkins. I have a goat that got out and got into his yard. That's how I met him. So anyway, tell him you met the guy that... Okay, so before we get into the nuts and bolts on how to start a business, I talked with the dean and Professor Theobald about actually like the nuts and bolts of how to do it, right? What to do and how to do it. I'd like to ask you to think about kind of two important things. Really, the first one is the most important. And I know Robert Workman came from Goal Zero recently and talked to you about the why, defining your why. And I think he kind of refers to that as like coming up with your personal constitution or your values or whatever. I guess my question is entirely more basic than that. It's why do you want to start a business, right? So Robert's right. When you need to kind of have this mission statement in life and have kind of the defining values in your life around what you're doing, in your vision and your kind of core morality, if you will. Once you've kind of got that, I guess the second question, even though it's the same word, why, is just totally more basic, right? Why do you want to be an entrepreneur, right? Or why do you want to start a business? Everything that you do from the answer to that question will dictate the how you do it, right? So let me give you an example. I mean, the last couple years, I've noticed in my office, I probably get 20 calls a week from startups, right, that want to start or incorporate their business, and it's a variety of, it's either tech or it's something else. The last call I got was somebody wanted to start a yogurt shop, string of yogurt shops at the malls. I've had a guy who wanted to start country and western theme restaurants, a chain of country western restaurants. It's all kinds of stuff, right? And the how you do that is very, very challenging until you know why you're doing what you're doing, right? And entrepreneurship, like I said, last maybe 5 years has become cool, right? It's popular to be an entrepreneur. And that's, for me, that's a good thing, right? As an attorney that does this and as an investor that does this, I like the fact that people are thinking about entrepreneurship and thinking about how they may start businesses and may innovate and come up with ways that are better or faster or cheaper or whatever than the existing kind of model is now, in whatever industry it is. But that doesn't answer the question of why you want to be an entrepreneur. The truth is, entrepreneurship is very difficult. Being a founder is very, very challenging. And when it's like, past midnight and you're up and you're thinking about how to make payroll the next day and you don't have any money, or, you have employees that are perhaps suing you, or you have supply problems with your product or whatever it is. And those moments, if you don't know why you're doing what you're doing, it's very, very, I'm telling you, that's a lot of soul searching, at night. And so, I guess maybe another way to say this is, why is the result for you to be an entrepreneur and start your business better than the alternative, which, I don't know, working at Zions Bank or doing whatever, right? Why is it better or different or more rewarding or less rewarding, right? Once you kind of know the answer to that, the next thing I encourage you to think about is, or to realize, is that being an entrepreneur is, in every sense, a family affair. It just is. And, you need to realize that it's a lifestyle choice. It's not a career necessarily. And so being an entrepreneur is like a way of life, right? And it's very rewarding, but it's very challenging too. And so to make sure, if you're married or you have a significant other or a partner or whatever, that, you're kind of all in it together, because, you will be whether or not you want to or not, if you kind of haven't had that discussion, right, going forward. So once you've defined the why, right, the how is not really all that much rocket science, right? The nuts and bolts of how to start your business, is I'm sure there, it's basic kind of decisions. It's a lot of little decisions on how to structure things. And again, it depends on what it is you're trying to do. Does anybody here, who here is running a business now? I know I saw some hands that has a business they've started. What is it you do? Gun safes? That's cool, right? Is it on a retail model? How do you do it? On an internet, or how do you do it?
We started out just doing a lot on KSL.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, cool. Anybody else running a business right now? Anybody have an idea? Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Great. That's a great example, right? How you're going to do that is a lot different than how he's going to do it, right? In terms of how you structure your business, right? It'll be almost night and day different, probably, right? Anybody else have a business idea that they're thinking about? Maybe you haven't started yet? Anybody software or tech or anything like that has, code or an app or something they're thinking about? I don't know. I see your hand up. You? Okay. Yeah, how you do that business is a lot different than how you do, being a general contractor or being a retailer, right? And a lot of the structuring is a lot different. So let's get into that. I know this is maybe the, kind of the nuts and bolts or the, the boring part of this, but, kind of the X's and O's. Okay, so here's kind of the roadmap. No matter what business it is you're going to start ever in life, there's really some basic questions you kind of have to ask. It's which kind of entity you want to form, right? What kind of company do you want to have, right? And innovation and business is great, but you have to have a way to kind of harness that and make money from that, and kind of drive the revenue, right? So what kind of entity? That's driven totally by the how or the what you're doing or the why you're doing it, right? Choosing where to form it. I know we're all in Utah here, but depending on what kind of business that you want to start or the company, where you actually form that may be relevant, right? The organizational documents, that's kind of nuts and bolts legalese, right? What documents and how to do it and what to think about when you document that. Getting the company up and running, there's a lot of legal stuff around doing that. That's important. The liability shield is absolutely critical. That's why you form a company primarily, is to protect yourself and your personal assets from creditors or other people. And then I threw in one last thing. I'm not sure if y'all are thinking about this, but taking on investors and exit strategies, that's one maybe in the startup phase that people don't think about a lot. Maybe the investors, they do a little bit, but it's critical to kind of have the end in mind, right? Plan for success. And if that's something you're thinking about doing now, if you may want to do that, take on an investor, for example, or maybe build your business and flip it and sell it. How you structure it is critical, right? It's in the beginning. How you build it becomes really important to those eventual buyers or investors. So let's dive into this. Okay, so which entity to form? There's kind of some basic options, right? There's no entity, right? Which, not to be funny, but you can just have no entity. You can operate as a sole proprietor. You can just run your business out of your checking account, or you can file a DBA. So it's Travis Wilson DBA gunsafe.com, right? If you wanted to do that. I don't recommend that. But you certainly can do that. There's a lot you're giving up by doing that, but if that's the way you want to go, that's definitely an option for you. Partnerships are another one. The Remedies people were here last week. Isaac told me talking about partnerships. That's not what we're talking. This is a legal partnership on how to do this. Legal partnerships, there's not a lot of formalities around those. So you and me talking right now, we say, hey, let's go into business together, and you say, okay. we just formed a partnership, right? That's about all there is to that. There's two kinds of partnerships. There's limited and general. The general partnership is more kind of focused in the investment context. And that's about enough of that one, right? It's probably not that common for you to do a partnership in the legal technical sense, right? This next one is a lot more common, limited liability company or LLC. Do you have an LLC? Is that what you do? Corporation? Are you guys an LLC or a corporation? LLC? Okay. LLC is probably the most common at this stage, I would say, like especially in Utah. It's the most flexible. It gives you a lot of options. It doesn't have a lot of the formalities of a corporation, but allows you to have the liability protection of a company, which is critical in your business. It's also has, again, the least formalities, right? So you don't have to have minutes, and you don't have to have shareholder meetings and send out notices and all that kind of stuff. Frankly, it's just expensive to run a corporation and have a lot of shareholders and stuff. And so if you're just kind of two people or just you maybe, and you're kind of bootstrapping it, building your business, it's perhaps cheapest and easiest to be a limited liability company, right? There's a corporation, which when you talk stock and investing and all that, that's C Corp. There's two corporations, C Corporation and S Corporation rather, but generally people are referring to a C Corporation, right? When you sell shares and you buy shares of common stock on the stock exchange, those are all C Corporations. A little variation of an S Corporation, which is kind of a tax advantage that you can do. And then there's something new called an L3C. I didn't know, I put that one on there. That's kind of a rare new thing. Anybody doing an L3C or know even what that is? Okay, we'll skip that one. That's for like kind of social enterprise, right? Kind of low profit, limited return kind of stuff. But if you're not doing that, let's move on. Okay, so a lot of the decisions on what kind of company to form. So there's the what you're doing, right? What kind of business it is, and then there's the tax implications of that, right? So everyone's heard of double taxation. This is the taxations of a corporation, and you've all heard of double taxation and the dreaded double taxation. This is how it works. The company pays tax on ordinary income, and then you, the shareholder, pays the tax again on the dividend, right? And that sounds like a terrible thing. Sometimes it's not the end of the world, depending on what you're doing. But that's kind of the flow chart on how taxation works, right? So there's what you're doing and then the tax. And this is a huge component to why you either form a corporation or an LLC or whatever, is how you're going to be taxed. The taxation of a LLC is what's called pass-through. So it flows into what's called your personal tax return. So you're issued a K-1 from the company, and that reports to your personal return. All the money goes into the company. It all goes to you as an individual, as a shareholder, and then you pay tax on that on ordinary income. That can be a big distinction, right, depending on what kind of business it is, right? If it's just you kind of, if you're the guy that owns a yogurt shop or you have a T-shirt business out here, that's probably okay, right? If you have a lot of shareholders or you want to have a lot of members or whatever, that probably doesn't work as well, right? Then there's this variation we talked about real briefly, S Corporation, which is like the combination of the two of them, right? Pass-through plus dividends, right? And really the game here is, you can divide the dividend and salary payments to yourself as a business owner, and you can split those and pay tax on those differently. And in certain circumstances, you come out ahead on an income tax basis. There are limitations, though, on being an S Corp, so don't run out and say, I want to be an S Corp forever. There's a lot of limitations on structuring an S Corp. There's a finite number of shareholders you can have. You can only have one class of stock, for example. Stuff like that. If you get this wrong, you file an S Corp, you tell your accountant I want to be an S Corp, and you get it wrong, the default is you're a C Corp. And if the whole game is to get around double taxation, now you're back into being a C Corp, and you just got hit with double taxation. So you have to kind of be a little careful when structuring an S Corp. Okay, where to form your company? We're all here in Utah. From what I'm hearing in terms of what y'all are doing, there's probably not a huge reason to be a Delaware corporation, for example, or another state's corporation if you're living here and doing business here. The considerations there when you do file a foreign company is the filing requirements, the local versus the local filing requirements. So what do you actually have to file? So if you're a corporation, it's articles of incorporation, for example. You have to file. If you do that in Delaware, you have to mail them back there and hire a registered agent, and it costs like $400. And as opposed to Utah, which is like $70 to file that and file the renewals. The registered agent issue. If you're not in Utah, you can be your own registered agent in Utah, which is just an expense that you don't have to pay if you're in Utah. If you want to file a Utah business, any other state, you have to file a registered agent, or you have to hire a registered agent in that state, and the fees vary. I've seen them $50 a year to like $400 a year. It's maybe not the end of the world. It's not going to like put anybody into bankruptcy, but it's maybe just an expense that you don't want to have to incur if it doesn't matter, right? If you're the guy that wants to have a t-shirt business in the hallway here, I don't know that it's an expense that makes a lot of sense. If it does make sense for you, the jurisdictions, kind of the famous ones, are Delaware, Nevada and Wyoming, and obviously Utah. Anybody here from California? A lot of you? Yeah, I apologize now if you want to start a business in California. That's not a very business favorable, great state to live and a lot of cool stuff going on, but very challenging to be a business owner in California. There's a lot of requirements in state law there about shareholders and stuff like that. And so from a founder's owner's perspective, it's just a lot easier to avoid California if you can. Most people in California, by the way, that I've seen that have sophisticated business, they file their company in Delaware, right, to get around the California issue. Okay, so these are the organizational documents, right? And again, it depends on what you're doing, right? So if you're an LLC, it's a limited liability company agreement or operating agreement. If you're a corporation, it's the bylaws. There's other documents, and these are kind of the things to think about no matter what you're doing, even if it's a partnership or anything, right? It's planning for success now. And I don't think anybody, actually I've never met an entrepreneur that's ever called me and said, I'm planning on failing within the next year, so I just want to kind of cruise through this stuff and get my business going so that we can fail as quickly as possible, right? Plan for success, think about success, and these are kind of some important elements, in corporate law to think about. It protects you, the founder, and it ensures to some degree success down the road. One is the management structure of your company. That's another way to say like who controls what. So if you want to have, a CEO and a board of directors as your corporation, or if it's an LLC, it's managers. But how are those managers or those directors or officers, what do they get to do, right? What's the authority that you're going to give them as a founder, right? So it's the structure. There's different types of ownership. And the easiest one maybe is stock in a C corporation, different kinds of stock, so preferred stock or common stock, different classes of stock. There are different rights and privileges that go with different kinds of stock. And so if any of you were a technology company or a software company, you'd have to get really familiar with how that works, because that's how that world works, with preferred and common shares in a corporation. In the investment context, there's distribution, so how you get paid based on what you own. So if you own 50% of the business, for example, so if you guys as gunsafe.com or whatever it's called, each own 50%, that doesn't necessarily mean you each get 50% of the money, right? Depending on how you split it. So you need to think about that before you kind of get going, when you're kind of doing the foundation stuff. And then there's something here I threw in called capital call obligations. Occasionally, rarely, sometimes businesses run out of money and they need more. So if that happens to you, how are you going to handle that, right, as owners of the company? So if you issue what's called a capital call, which means the company sends a letter to the owners that says we need more money, we need $100,000, we each own 25%, y'all need to each put in $25,000 additional dollars, or maybe it's $2,500 or whatever it is. How are you going to handle that, right, when that comes up? You don't want to be the only founder that's putting in the money, right? And keeping things going, if there's not a way for you to kind of recoup some of that or maybe get more shares or whatever, right? Vesting is a huge one. Share vesting, anybody ever dealt with that already? No, not so much. Okay, so vesting, in terms of founding a company, being a business, not a startup, if you will, vesting is a huge deal. It protects kind of the founders from each other, if you will. I mean, the most common call I ever get from a startup that's been going for a while, they're in the emerging phase, is they say, hey, listen, we started this like in college, like 2 years ago. We had this great code and application that was really hot. It was the #1 downloaded application on iTunes. That actually happened, by the way, to me. And they said, yeah, but we had 4 founders. We all were working on this as juniors and seniors in college when we all kind of lived together and it was easy. But now one of the guys, he just decided he wanted to join the Air Force and he's leaving, right? So what do we do? And we say, okay, did you vest equity, right? Did you give him his 25% on day one? Yes, we did. Well, there's nothing you can do, right? Find his address where he's going to live in the Air Force and just start sending him his distribution. That's what you can do, right? If they would have vested equity, which means you give it to somebody over time, right, depending on how long they're in the business, then you can avoid some of those problems, right? So, the common way you do that is, in a tech context, right, is you get a certain equity grant or an option grant that kind of vests over time. So maybe you get 10% of the total grant when you're hired. You have to be there a year for another percentage to vest. So maybe you get 10% more when you've been there a year. And then there's maybe a period of every so often going forward, you get another block that kind of vests or becomes yours over time, right? You know, that's a big deal, you know, in your success going forward, especially if it's not a family situation or something. It's like your friend or your partner. That's a real big deal. The one caveat I'll tell you, which is a kind of a game that professional investors play, is they try to make you vest founder stock, right? If that's happening to you, that's not what I'm talking about, right? So if you go to an investor and they say, well, you each own 50%, now we want you to vest your 50%. That's not that, right? You should say, no, I mean, these are our shares. If you want to give us additional shares or whatever going forward, you know, we can, but not founder shares. The next big one is restrictions on transfer. That's kind of a carry-on investing. You know, in terms of if you're a partner with somebody and they want to get out of the business, you know, how does that work, right? And there's technical ways that works. This is kind of the legal buzzwords, right of first refusal. There's something called drag along. There's something called tag along. That are kind of these legal buzzwords you hear investors talk about a lot. That's how that works. You know, think about that ahead of time. So basically just if we don't want to be partners anymore, or say I want to stay in the business but you want to leave, how's that going to work, right? Am I going to have to buy your stock? Is the company going to have to buy your stock? Can you just give it back for nothing? Can you give it to your neighbor? I mean, how's that all going to work? Do I want to be a partner with somebody that I didn't contemplate as a partner when we started the business, right? Basically, that's that issue. And then there's indemnification of managers and officers. For those of you that may not be the founder, but you're like the manager or the boss, if you will, you're working there, that's a big deal to have indemnification from the company. So basically, if you're sued, if you as a general contractor are sued, right, because you build something and it falls over, and you're just the foreman, right, you want to be indemnified by the company, right? You want them to cover legal expenses, or you want them to protect you. If you're sued, cover the cost if there's damages. That kind of stuff. That's another one that people don't think about all that often, but becomes kind of a gotcha later on, right? If there's an issue. Okay, so this is kind of where the rubber hits the road, right? So now you've thought about kind of the organizational structuring, how you do that. This is kind of the next step, which is getting your business up and going. Anybody created a cap table? Yes, no? You know what that is? Cap table is a big deal. You know, it's basically who owns what of your company. Usually they're an Excel sheet, you know, spreadsheet. They're very basic, but it tells you who owns what percentage of what kind of shares or units, right, in your company. That's an absolutely huge deal. Very rarely do I see startups have one of those, right, unless they're working with somebody that knows what they're doing. That's a big deal to know who owns what. You know, later on down the road, you know, if you haven't thought of that or whatever, you're sitting there with your partner and you say, you know, I think I own 51%, you own 49, and he says, no, I own 51, you own 49, or if there's four of you, it's who owns what and when. And then you issued a capital call, maybe at one point, and somebody put in money, and not everyone put it in the same amount of money, and it rebalances the shares, and then who owns what of what. It becomes complicated, right? So create a cap table and maintain the cap table. If you don't know how to do that, talk to somebody who does, you know, a person like me that can do that for you, or at least show you how to do it. And keep that. It's something that takes you 5 minutes a year to do, but it saves you a lot of time and headache and expense down the road. The other one is your federal employee identification number. If you're planning on having, you know, filing a tax return or hiring employees or whatever, you have to have that. Okay, that's a 5-minute phone call to the IRS after you file your articles of incorporation organization. You have the number from the state. You either just call the IRS, or you can send in a form and they give you a federal EIN, right? You may have heard that abbreviation, but you have to have that. Bank accounts are a huge deal. How many of you run your business out of your checking account, right? I see that like all the time, right? That's a big deal. So open a bank account, right? Go talk to a banker, you know, or someone you know, and have a business bank account in your business's name, right? And it can be a little tricky your first time to get one of those. They may have deposit requirements or whatever, but you know, you need to have a business account, you know, that has your corporate money, right? Not your checking account. Business licenses, depending on what you're doing, that's a big deal. Insurance is a huge deal. Again, depending on what you're doing, if you're a builder like him, insurance is a really big deal. If you're, you know, selling software, it's maybe not as big of a deal. But find out whatever the risk is for whatever you're doing, and make sure you're covered from an insurance standpoint. Trademark and intellectual property, I put this on here because this is, I think, like one of the ones. This is another phone call that I get like every day. People calling and they say, hey, I have this great idea for an app, right? And I programmed it, and I did it in open source, and it's on iTunes right now, and I got 50 downloads, and I want to patent this thing, right? That's what people call. You know, I mean, that's good for you if you want to patent that. It's going to take you probably 3 years to get a patent on your intellectual property, and even then, right, if you get a patent, your parents will say, like, good for you, and they'll, like at Christmas, they'll talk about, hey, you know, you got a patent on his innovation, right? That's about as far as it'll go. Because when Microsoft or Apple comes and steals your innovation, right, and they just blatantly steal your patent, you're forced with the choice of talking to someone like me and out-litigating Apple, right, and outspending Apple in litigation. It's just frankly not going to happen, right? I mean, this is what they do for a living, right? It's not to say that it's fair what happens to you in that scenario, but as an emerging startup company, it's probably not the most critical thing to spend $25,000 or $100,000 getting a patent on some innovation. There's exceptions to that. Biotech is one. There's some exceptions to that, but that's kind of the general rule. More important with intellectual property is to make sure if you have employees, that you, the company, own the intellectual property that they're creating, right? So it's called an invention assignment agreement. Any company that has creative people that are either programming or developing work product or anything like that, it's critical that you, the company, own that, right? So when you actually become super successful and your app on iTunes now has 50 million downloads, the developer, your engineer comes to you and says, oh yeah, by the way, that code is mine, right? You say, wait a minute, I've been paying you the whole time and you work for my company. And he says, yeah, but I didn't give you the intellectual property, so I want that back now, right? That happens more than you would realize, right? So that's critical. The other one is contracts for critical transactions. That depends on what you're doing, but talk to somebody that you know, or someone like me. If you're if you're going to be doing business deals, make sure that from a contract basis you're protected. You have payment terms in there. You're going to get paid. You're going to be able to deliver what you said you're going to deliver on time and at the price you said you're going to, and you have a basis for that if something goes wrong. Okay, liability shield we talked about before. The basic principle of a liability shield is that you, the owners, are not liable for what happens in your business, right? It's the benefit of living in the United States, right? We're not responsible, right? You're liable up to the amount of your investment. I guess I'll say it that way. So if you started a business and you each put in $10,000 or $1,000, that's the most you're liable, right? You can lose your $1,000, but not more than that. Right? If you don't form a company, that's not the case, and you can be personally liable for what happens in your business. So, to use the building example, you build something that falls over and hurts somebody, they call you and they say, how much is your house worth? Because that's how much we're going to sue you for, right? If you don't have that done right. That's a big thing. In the United States, in terms of our economy here and commercializing innovation, that's one of the reasons that we are able to do in the U.S. what we do. Is because entrepreneurs can really go for it, and if it fails, the company is liable for that, not them personally, right? There are ways around that, piercing the veil, so if you're not careful and you don't follow formalities, there are attorneys that will try to make you personally liable for what your business does. A lot of stuff like running your bank account out of a business bank account, not your checking account, following kind of the formalities is really critical to that. Having the business structured properly, signing things in your official capacity as an owner, not personally, those kinds of things. That becomes a big deal in liability protection. And right now, in the startup phase, you may not be thinking about that as much, but as you get going and as you become successful, you'll start to, if you haven't thought about that, you'll start to really worry about that. Okay, one other trick, I put this in here just to talk about real briefly. One other thing about liability protection, there's another way you can do it too, is from a business structuring standpoint, right? You've heard about companies using subsidiaries. Depending on what kind of business you have, you can do that too. You can separate the intellectual property you may own or your product from the profit streams, and if you own property, real property or something like that, you can separate that into another entity. So in this case, you'd have 5 total companies, right? And they'd be 4 would be subsidiaries of the big one, and then you'd have to have intercompany agreements between all of them, right? So they can each use the assets of the others. That's a little more sophisticated. In tech context, that works really well. Some others works pretty well, but that's another way to kind of do the liability protection, as apart from just getting insurance and doing things right. Okay. So let's talk about investors. Anybody here plan on getting investors in your business? Anybody ever thought about doing that? Okay. Anybody here ever worked with investors before? All right. Okay. Well, let me just say it to you this way. As a professional investor, investors are just really not your friends. Let me just say it to you, simple as that. It's not to say you shouldn't, you should hate them or you should be mean, whatever. But investors are in the business of making money, right? And your innovations and your business that you're doing, it may be the best thing ever, right? And you may think it's the most curve jumping, paradigm shifting, efficient, whatever, right, ever conceived. But investors are there to make money, right? That's really what they're doing, professional investors. And so you got to keep that in mind when you deal with investors going forward. It depends on what kind of business you have and what you're trying to do. Going back to the why, like what you're trying to do and how you're trying to do it. But keep in mind always that they're there really to provide you either capital, money, and maybe some mentorship, but pretty much mostly money, and to kind of fuel your innovation, right, and fuel your growth. That's what they do, right? They're not your friend. They may become your friend, right? But their primary purpose is to return capital, right? Our fund, Merit Venture Partners, our criteria is that we will not do a deal unless we can return the entire fund from one deal, right? So, we're looking for like the next Google, right? So the guy who has the yogurt shop or the t-shirt business or whatever, that's a great business, I think it is, but it's just maybe not a good fit for certain kinds of investors, right? So that context kind of determines how you take the money from investors, right? If you're a business that needs capital to go, primarily that's done through a private offering. If you're not a bank candidate or you don't have like parents that are just going to give it to you or friends or whatever, it's done through what's called a private offering. It gets into securities regulation. The general rule is you have to register. When you go to raise money, you have to register your raise, unless you fit into certain exemptions, right? It's Regulation D of Rule 506 of the 1933 Securities Act. That's like legalese, right? But that's kind of what it is. And if you fit into that exemption and you raise money from what's called accredited or sophisticated investors, you can there's an unlimited amount of money you can raise if you follow certain rules. The biggest of which is you have to comply with what's called Rule 10b-5, which is the anti-fraud requirement, which I guess summed up means you have to give the investors all information in a non-misleading way. Okay, so anything that's material to them making an investment in your business, you have to disclose to them in a non-misleading way. Okay, that's kind of the nuts and bolts of that. That's maybe down the road. If you're not a tech person or you're not whatever, that's maybe not as applicable to you. But that's kind of something to be aware of with investors. Okay, so exit strategies. I think everybody, at some point has thought about, having an exit strategy or big exit. You've heard about some of the big famous ones in Utah recently. The Adobe Omniture deal or the Vivint deal recently, or even Qualtrics, which isn't necessarily an exit, but it's a big kind of payday for the founders. This is kind of the considerations on how you maybe do that. And if you're working on a business where you're thinking that way, this is some stuff to think about now. It's the no exit where you just sell some of the equity, you sell some of the stock, and you maintain payments to yourself. You expand the management and you hire management to take over the day-to-day of how to do that, or strategic alliance with another company. So you kind of downplay your time investment. You still get paid, you still own stock, but you're not as involved day-to-day. Partial exit is more of like a private equity deal where someone will come in and buy a significant portion of your company, and kind of in combination with the first one, you downgrade your time investment and you become maybe a board member or not as much day-to-day. And then there's the full exit, which is what you've heard about recently, right? Where there's a full-on merger and acquisition where they actually sell all the stock in their company, or they sell the entire company, the assets or whatever, and you see big, huge numbers, billions of dollars, right, going to the founders. It's hard to think, when you start your business, it's hard to think about maybe the exit, right, at the end of the day. But if you kind of at least can sort it, like spend a little time thinking about maybe what your long-term goal is, going back to the very beginning on how you structure things, it becomes a little easier, right, to streamline that and put things in place that may make these a lot easier, right? For example, if you're a tech company and you want to have a big exit and you file yourself as an LLC in Utah, one of these are probably not all that likely for you, right, in terms of a big exit as an LLC. The fund that comes and wants to buy your code or your company will convert you to a C Corp before they do all the work to buy your company. And it would have just been a lot easier if you had done it the first time, right, as a C Corp. Okay. All right, I've got some final thoughts. I've saved some time for questions. We can talk about whatever you want, but kind of some final thoughts is, to always remember your why you're doing this, why are you being an entrepreneur, why are you forming a business. It's challenging, it's rewarding, but, again, when you're up at night, in your home office, laying on the floor at 2 a.m, trying to figure out how you're going to make payroll, if you can remember like why you're doing this, it's just those decisions are a lot easier, right? The fortitude to kind of stick with it's a lot easier. Get help from qualified people. You know, I can't say it easier than that. I mean, there's a lot of people around UVU that are willing to help you do what you want to do. I'm one of them. If you have ideas or you want to talk about stuff or whatever, you know, get help from people who have been there and done that before. You know, a lot of times, at least for me, I mean, you know, in the legal context even, you know, an attorney is not an attorney, right? There's different attorneys that do different kinds of things. And if you're starting a business and you have questions about corporate formation or whatever, you know, if you go to someone who's like a defense attorney, criminal defense attorney, they may not be able to help you all that much, right? And it's important if you're serious about being successful. Vest equity and manage your capitalization table. For the serious entrepreneurs, I mean, seriously, like double underline that. You know, vest your equity for your employees and your founders and manage the cap table like crazy, right? If you have 100 investors, you know, or if you have people you're giving stock to in the initial phase, and me as the investor comes in, I look at your capitalization table and there's 70 shareholders in there, I'm going to be mad, right? So manage that and know exactly who owns what of what, and make sure you vest the equity in the first place. Understand what you've agreed to as a company. So if you have a bylaws or an operating agreement, or you have a shareholders agreement or a buy-sell agreement or whatever that is, know what it says, right? And know the terms you're on with your co-founders. You know what you've agreed to. Know what your contracts, you know, say, your form contracts, and know what, you know all that stuff. So you're conversant with your partners about who owns what and what the rights are of everybody. Get insurance. That's a big deal. Get insurance. It's one of the most overlooked things. Make sure, depending on what it is your business is doing, work with an insurance broker, an agent, to make sure it's tailored to what you're doing. Provide you enough coverage. Hire a CPA. Okay, you don't have to have like an in-house guy, but get an accountant that knows what he's doing. The number one failure, I'll tell you, that I see business failure stems from accounting, not knowing the accounting, right? Or doing the accounting wrong, or not understanding it, or having like their brother-in-law do it who's a sophomore in the accounting program at BYU or something. I mean, make sure you're really on the accounting. The CFO, consider a part-time CFO, that's kind of a follow-on to the first one, someone that can manage your books and manage your finances. Again, the number one failure, I mean, and we're talking good companies that have great products and great potential that just fail because they don't manage the finance part of that all that well. They're focused on innovation and sales, and they kind of let something else lag. And then last, be nice, right? It's just too small of a world to not be nice to people and be nice to each other. The reality is, as an entrepreneur, you're going to do this again. You're probably going to do a business 3-4 times in your life, and if you're nice to people and treat people right, they're more than willing to help you going forward, and you'll be more successful in general anyway. If you stay here in Utah, the business world here is very small. So if you're not nice, people are going to hear about it, right? They're going to be less willing to help you. Conversely, if you are great to work with and you're nice and you're smart and you're good to work with, people will come out of the woodwork ready to help you. So anyway, okay, that's what I've got for you. Again, time is yours. We can talk about whatever you want.
Maybe could you expound a little bit on like writing your business off or whatever, as if it's in Delaware or?
So you mean like where to file your company? Yeah. So all that's really involved in that is it depends what kind of company, right? So if you want to be like a home builder, right, that's building homes, and Utah's fine, right? It's not there's no real advantage in my opinion between being a Utah corporation or a Delaware corporation, right? Yeah, so if you lived in California and you wanted to get out of some of the rules in California that are a little harder for a business owner, Delaware is a great option. The other advantage to Delaware is the corporate law in Delaware has been around forever, right? It's really old, really established. There's thousands and thousands of cases that have been litigated on almost every business issue. The judges in Delaware know business. So it's really stable and safe, right, from a foundational standpoint, right? If you want to take investors, right, that perhaps the investor lives in California, right, and you live in Utah, or maybe it's the other way around, Delaware, people understand what it means to be a Delaware company, right? They don't have to learn the nuances of Utah law or whatever, state's law, right? They can go to Delaware, they understand what that is, and it's kind of a known commodity, if you will.
So when you do that, does it basically mean that you run your business according to the law of that state? Is it?
Right.
What I guess I want to say is, I know a guy who bought like a $200,000 Ferrari, and he says he has a PO box in Kansas, so he
right.
$60 a month.
Right.
I mean, it's completely.
Yeah, so as a Delaware corporation, right, you're headquartered in, your business is formed in Delaware, but maybe you're operating in Utah, right? So if there's any litigation, there's any disputes or whatever, you have to comply with Delaware law, right? Now, as a practical matter in Utah, if you're a Delaware corporation and you go to court, the judges will look up Delaware law and they'll apply Delaware law to you. right? That's the way that works. And so it's very stable, you know, very understood. And for investors, it's a huge deal because they know what all that is, right? It's more expensive because there's different kind of expenses with that, with cost. But again, it might be a good option depending on what kind of business you're doing, right? Yeah. Right. All right, thanks.